Hi, I'm Justin Dries, the Vice President of Communications with the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of our 2020 Washington Conference virtual updates. Joining me right now is Mary Nowak from our staff, and she's going to be here to talk about issues involving immigration and agricultural labor today. So, hi Mary, how are you doing today? How are things down in Texas?
Doing great, Justin. It's getting a little warm. It's June. We're already approaching 100 degrees here and haven't had any rain yet in June. So hopefully we'll get some rain here soon.
So Mary, to start things off, I know the pandemic is what has been on everyone's mind, and that early on, when things first started unfolding, there was a lot of concern about farmers and ag employers not being able to get the H2A workers that they needed at this time. How's the H2A program holding up right now?
So far, we've been pretty fortunate, Justin. We were able to act very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic when we started hearing of various consulates that were closing down their offices, that were suspending visa interviews. We were able to work very closely. NCFC was with our partners in the Agricultural Workforce Coalition and really lean into those existing relationships that we had with administration officials, with congressional offices, and having them weigh in with various State Department officials to try to get things up and running and moving as quickly as possible and as close to normal as possible. So I think that we have been very fortunate to not see, huge delays to the arrival of our workers. There have been a few consulates, South Africa, for example. That one was a little bit more challenging to get the workers over to the U.S., but predominantly our workers come from Mexico. And working with our partners over in Mexico, we were able to, for the most part, work pretty seamlessly in getting our workers processed and transported here into the U.S. We've also been very fortunate that we've had an ally in the administration in Secretary Perdue, who absolutely understands the importance of this workforce. And through the various executive orders and positions that have come out of the administration, you can tell that he has been very instrumental in weighing in with the administration and talking about the value of this workforce and how needed they are so that we're able to continue putting food on the tables.
One of the other things that I know that we've been seeing with the pandemic is that unemployment here in the United States has gone way up, even though it's easing off a little bit as things are opening up. One of the things in agriculture that we've long talked about has been the difficulty in finding domestic workers to work on the farm. Has there been any increased interest in working in agriculture due to the high unemployment?
Unfortunately, no, we have not seen that uptick or the increased amount of domestic workers that are showing up on farms ready and willing to do this type of work. Many of our farmers said they might have predicted this. As you know, as part of the H2A program, you are required to first recruit for domestic workers before you are approved for H2A guest workers. And so many of our farmers have long been documenting the challenges that they have had recruiting domestic workers. So I think that this pandemic and 20% unemployment, and still we're not able to find enough workers to fill these jobs on America's farms. I've heard anecdotally maybe one or a couple of workers, domestic workers, have showed up, but I think it also begs the question of maybe they were temporarily laid off from their jobs. What happens when they go back to their normal jobs? Are they going to be able, is the farm going to be able to fill someone immediately after they lose that workforce? Another issue that we've also heard about is it seems that the high unemployment is hitting the urban areas a little bit harder than it is in rural communities. I know, thinking about my hometown, a lot of the jobs here are pretty essential. You have a lot of small towns, a lot of rural communities, that the jobs or the services and the businesses are really essential to keep that community running. And so there wasn't as much unemployment that I've seen in some of these rural areas that you really see in the urban areas. And are you able to recruit people not only from your immediate area, but essentially from these urban areas to come work in rural areas where most of the farms are? So that's also been a barrier that I know a lot of folks have been experiencing. But I think the most important thing is we really encourage you to keep track of this information and share that with us, share these stories, because we've been talking about the challenges of recruiting a domestic workforce for years now. And being able to highlight that despite 20% domestic unemployment, you know, your operation in Texas or North Carolina or wherever was only able, you know, to have one person out of, you know, a request for 200 or however many it may be show up. I mean, that speaks very loudly, and that will absolutely help us carry our message on Capitol Hill as we're advocating for legislative reform to fundamentally address some of these challenges that we experience in the program.
As we enter the heart of the growing season, especially for a lot of fruits and vegetables and labor-intensive crops, kind of from now through the fall, you know, do you think the pandemic will continue to have an effect on producers' abilities to get that, you know, crop harvested?
Yeah, so we obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, there were some challenges that arose, and we were able to act quickly. And for the most part, we're able to operate somewhat normal. Going forward, it's I think that there might be a different set of issues and challenges that we might face. I think one of the challenges that we are starting to experience is we are seeing an increased number of outbreaks on farms. The outbreaks are happening, whether it's predominantly domestic workers, whether it's H2A workers. The virus isn't really choosing which one it's not disparaging one group or the other. It is a challenge that a lot of our farmers are working through. The CDC recently released guidance on things that farms in particular could do to help minimize the transmission and likelihood that their workers would catch the virus. I think, you know, for all of our workers, for all of our farms, their livelihood depends on having workers there to do the farm work, to do the harvest. And so they are very much so cognizant of the importance of this workforce and wanting to try to keep them as safe as possible. But again, I think having some of these resources from the CDC, you know, PPE and protective equipment is incredibly important. And USDA has been working, maybe trying to do some resources for farmers, because all these things, they don't come free. They do cost money, and many farms already operate on very thin margins as it is. And so I think, you know, having the workers here, you know, operating under the assumption that we're able to continue to process our H2A workers and continuing to utilize our domestic workers, out dealing with incidences of the virus transmission and being able to really isolate that, and so that it does not move throughout your workforce. So I think that's going to be a big challenge. I think another challenge is kind of more politically and what we might see come out of the White House. We are getting closer and closer to an election. We have certainly seen some rhetoric from the administration wanting to clamp down on immigration. I think that's been a longstanding position of the administration, but particularly in light of this pandemic, reducing the number of people that are coming into the country. So far, H2A and agriculture has been omitted from some of those executive orders and some of those actions. It is certainly our hope that we continue to be, but that doesn't mean that we are not still affected by some of the tightening of other programs. For example, the H2B program, which landscaping, some processing uses H2B, and then some non-ag as well. And so I think, if there are restrictions on that, that's just going to place greater pressure on the H2A program and any scrutiny on immigration, particularly with the intent of further restricting immigration, could potentially cause us harm as the year goes on.
Moving on from talking about the impact of the pandemic a little bit, and you just mentioned some of the administration's actions on visa programs more generally. One favorable thing that we've been hearing that the White House has is a new wage proposal for H2A. I know that you and most other people who use the H2A program know that the adverse effect wage rate is just not a very good metric to use in that program. Although I know that Chuck sent a letter, I think in late March or early April, about expressing a few concerns about this wage proposal to the White House. Can you give a little background on what's in that proposal and kind of why we sent the letter expressing concern?
Sure. Wages has certainly been something that we have long talked about as part of the H2A program. I think since the program's inception in the 80s, it's been certainly a challenging point that we've heard a lot of concern from farmers on. I think most recently, the volatility in the program and the exponential growth has been a huge barrier for a lot of farmers to be able to access the program. And so we have NCFC and the broader Agricultural Workforce Coalition has been engaged for many of years in looking at wage proposal alternatives. What can we do instead of the AWR that is fair, that is representative of wages that are paid, but that also doesn't discriminate against one part of the country over another? And I think that's where the White House proposal comes in. From our understanding, the proposal would have set wages and tied them to the state or local or federal minimum wage. In some states, particularly in the Southeast, you still have minimum wage in the $7 range, and that could have been very huge wage break for your workers. However, in California, in Washington State, we've even seen in New York, they are having rising state minimum wages, California approaching $15 an hour. And so if you have a wage construct that is tied to the whichever is the higher of the federal or the state, in this case, it would be the state, they would see a huge spike in what they are required. And there'd be a huge disparity as well between what workers are paid in one part of the country versus the other. And I think a lot of people like to talk about this as a California issue. I think people that don't like to talk about it as a California issue. But we're starting to see other states that are engaging in passing legislation that increases the minimum wage in their states. And so it would certainly impact all of those states as well. And so the letter that we sent up was really just raising this point that we have to be careful to not create a huge disparity across the states. And that would give essentially a competitive advantage to some farmers in certain parts of the country over others. Certainly states are free to, impose their own regulations, impose their own minimum wages. But when we are looking at a federal program, we want to try to make sure that we are not creating any additional disparities amongst states.
That's a great explanation, and it kind of points to the larger issue that, one of the things that would solve a lot of these problems is a new immigration program, a new visa program to kind of fix some of those deficiencies with the H2A program, and in a way to bring the current workforce that may not have proper documentation kind of into compliance. And last December, we saw the House of Representatives pass the first ag immigration bill in what, 30 years or 30 plus years or something like that. And I know the Ag Workforce Coalition was working at the start of this year on a Senate strategy, and then the pandemic hit, and that threw everything into a little bit of turmoil here in Washington, at least on the Capitol Hill side. I guess I have two questions. Is there any hope of getting an immigration bill through the Senate this year, or especially an ag immigration bill? And if not, what does the next Congress look like? Do you think there's a good opportunity there? And would this House bill kind of serve as a bit of a starting point there?
I think the House bill is certainly a great starting point. As you mentioned, we were in earnest discussions in the Senate on a bipartisan bill over there as well. That would be a counterpart to the House bill. With COVID happening, there hasn't been that, the negotiations have not kicked back into gear at this point. Unfortunately, I know the Senate is slowly starting to work on other issues besides relief packages. We've certainly seen some appropriations, some transportation things. So it is our hope, certainly, that the negotiations will be able to resume here shortly. I think that's one part of the puzzle. And then having Majority Leader McConnell actually put something on the Senate floor and get 60 votes in the Senate is a completely different dynamic. I'm significantly more confident on negotiations resuming and getting some progress on that end than the Senate being able to pass legislation. I think that there's a couple of long shot opportunities that we have here. I think that COVID has really exacerbated a lot of the underlying challenges that we have had with the H2A program. And it has made a lot of those challenges really come to light for everyone to see. And we are having senators that have not necessarily been engaged in this space, writing letters to the administration defending the H2A program. So for me, that's progress. That's an awesome opportunity. How can we capitalize on that demonstration of a recognition that this program is incredibly important, that this workforce is incredibly important, and utilize that to help us, get a bill through the Senate. So I am very hopeful that negotiations will resume. I think whether it can pass the Senate and the president signing it into law is a big question mark. On one side of what the president could do is, I think he's certainly really focusing in on his base and the priorities that his base wants. Well, farmers are his base, but at the same time, any kind of immigration bill is contrary to what the rest of his base kind of wants. And so where is he going to kind of play into that? Is he going to extend an olive branch to really try to remain and keep that support from the agricultural community? Or, will the other voices that he hears within the administration kind of win out and not support anything that would be considered as promoting immigration into the U.S.? So I think that's kind of where we stand for this year. I know it's not really an answer, but hopeful that negotiations will resume here shortly as the Senate is starting to get back to some of their, fundamental legislation that they work on every year. And as far as next Congress, there's just so many question marks on, does the House flip? Does the Senate flip? Does the president flip? Not knowing what each of those bodies are going to look like and who the leadership is going to be in each of those, it's hard to say. But I think that the goodwill that was really established through the development of the House bill and recognition that we could get a bipartisan bill out of a pretty partisan chamber in an not quite in an election year, but very close to it. I think that gave people a lot of faith. I think that a lot of folks are really hearing more about the challenges of the H2A program more than they have in a long time. It is more front and center. So I think you can't count next Congress out either, just in the event that we are not able to get anything done this year. And I will kind of end these comments on saying that just kind of seeing like the different things that have happened in 2020, I think so much of it is so unpredictable that this global pandemic would have happened. And then, you hear about the murder hornets. And then, it just seems like there's one thing after another. And it's just a crazy, crazy year. Like, who would have thought that this is how we would be holding our Washington conference, is, completely virtual. So all that to say, stranger things have happened. And normally it would be completely impossible to pass immigration reform, even if it's just for agriculture, so close to election or even in a lame duck session. But stranger things have happened.
Yeah, I think it's time will tell, and I wouldn't discount anything happening in 2020 that is possible to happen. So I think that's a good way to wrap things up here. And thank you, Mary, for giving everyone an update on immigration and ag labor. And if you want more information, you can go to the NCFC website, www.ncfc.org. With that, I'm going to bid Mary farewell and say goodbye. Until next time, everyone.